Tech stocks represent almost half of the value of all American stocks. And American stocks, by value, represent more than half of all stocks on the planet. Whoa! Are we putting too much money into this? Is the AI bubble about to burst?
Here's the truth no one in Washington wants to say out loud. If the US AI bubble pops, it won't just take down Silicon Valley, it could send shockwaves through the entire American economy. And at a moment when President Donald Trump is betting his second-term economic story on soaring tech valuations and AI hype, Canada is quietly building something far more durable. Real power, real resources, real national sovereignty.
Stocks and AI, because, and this is crazy, more than a third of stock value on America's main stock index, the S&P 500, comes from just 7 tech companies, all heavily invested in AI.
CBC's investigation recently posed a blunt, almost unsettling question. If the AI bubble pops, will the whole U.S. economy go with it? The concern isn't simply academic. Over the last 3 years, since the launch of GPT 3.50, American markets have been climbing one monumental wave. But a closer look reveals that nearly 1/3 of the entire S&P 500's value now comes from just 7 companies, almost all riding the AI surge. Nvidia has become the face of this concentration. Its chips power roughly 90% of the world's AI systems, its valuation has skyrocketed past several $1 trillion, and its influence is so dominant that its stock performance alone can move global markets. But behind the scenes, the company has been engaging in what analysts call circular investments, pouring billions into AI firms that then use that money to turn around and buy Nvidia's chips. Goldman Sachs now estimates that up to 15% of Nvidia's sales next year could come from this closed financial loop. Meanwhile, American tech giants have been borrowing heavily, issuing record volumes of corporate bonds to keep up with the exorbitant costs of new data centers, facilities that, according to recent reporting, now cost more to build than all other U.S. manufacturing projects combined. These centers require staggering amounts of electricity, cooling, land, and infrastructure, yet many of the companies behind them continue to lose money at breathtaking speed. OpenAI, for example, is forecasted to lose more than $70 billion over the next 3 years, even as its valuation approaches $500 billion. All of this raises a simple, uncomfortable question. How long can the U.S. economy ride a wave built almost entirely on expectations rather than profits? President Trump routinely points to the stock market as proof of American strength. But peel back the surface and it becomes clear that the market's resilience depends overwhelmingly on a handful of tech giants. If AI spending slows or investor optimism fades, the repercussions will be felt across the entire economy. This isn't just about a volatile sector. It's about the foundational role that tech now plays in America's financial system. As one analyst put it, tech stocks aren't just driving the market, they are the market. The AI sector also carries a paradox that traditional industries don't face. The more customers these companies gain, the more money they lose. Every query costs energy. Every model update requires thousands of new chips. Every training run demands massive capital outlays. The entire industry is built on the assumption that profitability will eventually arrive, somehow, someday, through a breakthrough in automation or artificial general intelligence. But investors are beginning to wonder how long they can subsidize the promise. This is where Canada's story becomes compelling. While the United States doubles down on AI speculation, Canada is grounding its future in assets that generate lasting value. Ottawa is expanding a clean energy grid that already sits at 85% emissions-free. Provinces are building high-voltage transmission links to move power across regions. New LNG corridors are emerging on both coasts. Critical mineral mines are being fast-tracked through the Major Projects Office, and Canada is deepening partnerships across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe to diversify trade away from an increasingly unpredictable United States. This contrast could not be sharper. The U.S. AI sector consumes electricity at a pace that utilities across multiple states now warn is unsustainable. Some regions are facing energy shortages, construction delays, and grid instability. Canada, by comparison, has decades of surplus hydroelectricity, vast potential for wind and nuclear, and the ability to export power-intensive products the world actually needs. When Prime Minister Mark Carney calls Canada an energy and resource superpower, it isn't rhetoric. It is a statement rooted in geography, engineering, and global demand. There is a geopolitical dimension here that often gets overlooked. Trump's second-term strategy, his tariffs, his pressure on allies, his America First negotiations all hinge on the U.S. economy staying strong enough to absorb the blowback. But if the AI bubble even partially deflates, that leverage collapses. A 10% correction in tech could wipe out trillions in market value. A deeper drop would push the United States toward recession. And because tech makes up nearly half the value of American equities, the shock would cascade through pensions, banks, and global markets. Trump needs the AI surge to hold. He needs the Magnificent Seven to keep climbing. He needs investors to believe the future payoff will justify today's extraordinary spending. But the fundamentals tell a different story. AI models age quickly. Chips become obsolete within a few years, and the infrastructure decays faster than any traditional industry. That is not a stable foundation. It is a pressure point waiting for a trigger. And this is where Canada's national confidence is rising. Canada's strength is rooted not in speculation, but in tangible value: vast natural gas reserves, strategic mineral deposits, immense hydro capacity, emerging Arctic trade routes, and a clean power industrial base that companies around the world want to tap into. These are assets that don't burst or deflate because they aren't tied to investor psychology. They are tied to physical demand. While Trump leans on the Magnificent Seven, Canada is building coalitions with South Korea, the UAE, Asian nations, Japan, and the European Union. The U.S. is concentrating risk. Canada is distributing opportunity. If the American AI gamble falters, Canada becomes one of the safest, most stable, most energy-rich economies in the Western world, and the global market will notice. There is an even deeper implication. If the AI bubble weakens, Trump's political model weakens with it. His tariff threats lose power. His economic narrative loses credibility. His ability to pressure allies diminishes. A market crash wouldn't just shake Wall Street, it would shake the geopolitical hierarchy of North America. The question that will define the next decade isn't whether AI will change the world. It will. The question is whether the payoff arrives before the correction. If it arrives, the United States will soar. But if the correction hits first, America will face an economic shock unlike anything since 2008. Canada isn't waiting for that answer. It is building a resilient future now, one rooted in clean power, critical minerals, diversified trade, and real assets that don't evaporate when a bubble bursts. In a world obsessed with prediction, Canada is preparing for reality, and that may be the smartest move of all.
This is our moment to define our next century. I am 100% confident that this budget is the right budget for this country at this moment. This is not a game.
The speed, scope, and scale of change that we're witnessing in Canada and around the world is quite unprecedented. That's why we need a strong response.
In Ottawa, the House of Commons fell silent. Cameras focused on Prime Minister Mark Carney as he rose to deliver his first national budget. There was no applause, no laughter, just quiet expectation. For weeks, headlines had questioned whether he could handle the pressure, whether his economic vision was too ambitious for a country caught between inflation worries and Donald Trump's tariffs. When he spoke, his voice was steady. This wasn't just a financial plan. It was the moment Canada decided what kind of nation it wanted to be in a world ruled by trade wars and uncertainty. This budget wasn't about political survival. It was about economic transformation. Carney called it a budget for the next century, and for many Canadians, it marked the start of something much bigger, a turning point in how Canada would stand on its own even as its largest trading partner turned protectionist. Before the budget day, the skepticism was intense. An Ipsos poll for Global News showed that 70% of Canadians believed the government should maintain a balanced budget. Another 42% wanted help with everyday expenses, while 32% prioritized lower income taxes. Only 1 in 4 cared about countering U.S. tariffs. Carney's opponents painted him as out of touch, accusing him of ignoring affordability and pushing Canada toward higher deficits. Yet he refused to back down. The former central banker, who once ran the Bank of England, seemed unfazed by political noise. He was focused on what he called generational investment, an idea that the country needed to build long-term strength rather than chase short-term relief. His message was unpopular but clear. Canada couldn't keep borrowing confidence from the United States. It had to earn it from within. When the numbers were released, even critics had to take a breath. The federal deficit would rise to around 75 billion Canadian dollars for the current fiscal year, according to projections cited by Reuters and the Financial Times. But the composition of that spending was what stunned observers. The budget poured tens of billions into infrastructure, railways, ports, highways, and airports, while boosting defense funding to historic levels. It also introduced targeted tax reforms to attract global investment. Companies could now write off capital assets more quickly, a move inspired by U.S. tax policy, but tailored to Canadian industries. At the same time, Carney ordered a major spending review, cutting or phasing out programs that had ballooned over the last decade. One example was the government's 2 billion trees program, which would stop halfway through. These savings would help fund what he called a pivot economy, one focused on innovation, logistics, and energy security. It was a mix of restraint and ambition, a blueprint that aimed to rebuild Canada's economic engine while keeping its fiscal credibility intact. The deeper message of the budget was not about numbers, but about strategy. Carney understood that Canada could not fight tariffs with more tariffs. Instead, he chose to fight with competitiveness. By investing in national infrastructure, modern manufacturing, and defense, Canada positioned itself as a reliable base for global supply chains that no longer trusted the volatility south of the border. The new tax structure made it easier for foreign investors to commit capital in Canada, just as American politics grew unpredictable. This approach quietly shifted Canada's role in the global trade war. Instead of reacting to Trump's pressure, Carney created the conditions to make Canada stronger without confrontation. The Financial Times called it a generational bet on national resilience. It was a different kind of power, not loud, not theatrical, but strategic. Carney also had to navigate politics. His government held a minority in Parliament, meaning one failed vote could trigger an election. Yet, through discipline and careful timing, he built a temporary bridge across party lines. NDP members, initially skeptical, found enough in the budget to avoid forcing a vote of no confidence. A few moderate conservatives even admitted the plan was more coherent than they expected. Instead of chasing applause, Carney used quiet authority. He convinced Parliament, not through slogans, but through logic, that a strong, self-sufficient Canada was in everyone's interest. Within days, media outlets described it as his first commanding political victory. For a leader only months into his tenure, it was a remarkable shift from defending his credibility to defining the national agenda. Beneath the politics lay a clear economic vision. The budget's theme, from reliance to resilience, was not just a slogan. It marked a structural pivot away from overdependence on U.S. markets. Funding was directed to projects that connected Canada more deeply with Asia and Europe. Investments in Pacific ports, digital trade infrastructure, and energy export routes were designed to support future partnerships with South Korea, Japan, and ASEAN nations. This was the economic counterpart to Carney's foreign policy message. Canada would remain a Western ally, but would no longer rely on American demand to secure growth. Economists described the shift as pragmatic rather than ideological. It recognized the reality of a changing global order where nations had to diversify or decline. For the first time in decades, Canada was not waiting for Washington to dictate its economic direction. It was charting its own course.
Of course, every transformation comes with costs. Some environmental initiatives were scaled back, the emission cap program was quietly shelved, and departments across government faced cuts of up to 15% in operational budgets over 3 years, as noted by the Parliamentary Budget Officer. But the trade-off was clear. In exchange, Canada would build new industrial capacity, strengthen national defense, and protect critical mineral supply chains, areas directly threatened by the global trade conflict. For many Canadians, this was a moment of uneasy pride. The cuts were difficult, but the purpose was unmistakable. The country was taking control of its economic destiny. The message behind the numbers was simple: real independence requires real sacrifice.
When the budget speech ended, there was no dramatic flourish. Carney simply closed his folder and sat down, as the chamber filled with murmurs. The opposition looked uncertain. Even his critics seemed to recognize that something had changed. Canada, for the first time in years, was not reacting to the world, it was leading with purpose. The budget silenced doubts not because it pleased everyone, but because it proved that leadership still matters. Carney had taken a divided, uncertain country and given it a clear direction: invest, adapt, and believe in itself. In an age when trade wars dominate headlines and leaders shout across borders, Canada's Prime Minister had chosen a different weapon: competence. As one analyst put it after the budget release, Trump rewrote the rules of global trade with confrontation. Carney answered with strategy. For Canada, that difference may define the next century.
The diplomatic relationship between Canada and China appears to be on the mend after years of strain and a more recent escalation in trade tensions, with both Ottawa and Beijing agreeing to reopen communication lines, potentially paving the way for a summit between Mark Carney and Xi Jinping.
Across the headlines this week, one story stands out. Canada and China are rebuilding ties after years of silence. Foreign Minister Anita Annan's visit to Beijing has reopened diplomatic channels, and both sides are now preparing for a possible summit between Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Xi Jinping. For many in Washington, this news came as a shock. Only a year ago, relations between Ottawa and Beijing were frozen, strained by disputes over canola, seafood, and the detention of Canadian citizens. Yet now, the same two nations are moving toward dialogue, trade, and cooperation. What changed? The answer lies not in Beijing, but in Washington. President Donald Trump's trade policies were meant to protect American industry and bring Canada closer under U.S. control. Instead, his tariff war has fractured North America's supply chains and pushed Canada to look elsewhere. Trump's 25% import tax on medium and heavy trucks takes effect in November, adding to a long list of duties on steel, aluminum, autos, and furniture. The goal was to pressure Canada to return manufacturing jobs to U.S. soil. The result has been the opposite. Rather than yielding to Trump, Ottawa is quietly reshaping its global position, one trade deal, one conversation, and one handshake at a time. In Ottawa, the mood is cautious but determined. After months of failed negotiations with Washington, the Carney government has begun to de-escalate. A new 100-page order published this month removes dozens of counter-tariffs on both the U.S. and China. The policy shift is sweeping. Many categories of Chinese steel and aluminum, previously restricted, can now enter Canada duty-free. Tariffs on American steel, health equipment, and even construction materials have been reduced. One Ottawa housing project, for instance, received an exemption to import steel doors tax-free. The reaction at home has been mixed. Canada's steel industry warned that cheaper Chinese imports could flood the market.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford urged a tougher line, saying the country must not bend under Trump's pressure. But Mark Carney took a different approach. There are times to hit back and times to talk, he told reporters. Now is the time to talk. Behind that calm tone lies a deeper calculation. Canada's auto sector has been hit hard since Stellantis announced it would move Jeep Compass production from Ontario to Illinois. 3,000 Canadian jobs lost, 5,000 gained in the U.S. The same tariffs designed to boost American manufacturing have crippled Ontario's supply chain. By easing counter tariffs, Carney is trying to stabilize costs for domestic producers and keep inflation from rising. More importantly, he's signaling to Washington that Canada still has options, and one of them is Beijing. As China hints at lifting restrictions on canola and seafood, both sides are preparing to discuss EV tariffs. If these talks succeed, it would mark the first real thaw between the two countries since 2018. For Carney, it is not about choosing China over the U.S. It is about restoring leverage in a world where Trump controls the economic board. Trump's tariffs were supposed to isolate China and reinforce U.S. dominance in North American trade. Instead, they have created an opening that China is quick to exploit. Beijing's economy has slowed, and exports need new markets. Canada, a G7 democracy with strained U.S. ties, fits perfectly. By reopening trade with Ottawa, China gains both an economic partner and a diplomatic bridge into the Western world. For the United States, this shift carries real consequences. Canadian importers now find Chinese metals and components cheaper than U.S. products weighed down by tariffs. Canadian farmers, previously locked out of Chinese markets, may regain access for canola and pork. In short, China is regaining ground through the very system Washington tried to weaponize. Meanwhile, the U.S. industrial heartland, the Midwest, is feeling the cost. Higher steel and transport prices are eating into profits. According to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, American construction firms have seen material costs rise by nearly 12% since early 2024. For them, Trump's trade war is not protection, it is punishment. And yet, the ripple effects stretch far beyond economics. Global investors are quietly adjusting their forecasts, shifting billions of dollars from U.S. assets into Canada's resource and manufacturing sectors. Ottawa's reputation as a stable gateway to both Western and Asian markets is gaining traction, while America's unpredictability under Trump is driving partners to hedge their bets. Even European automakers are now eyeing joint ventures in Canada to bypass U.S. tariffs and access cheaper Chinese materials. What began as a tariff wall has become a bridge, one connecting Beijing to North America through Canadian soil. And as Ottawa reopens its doors to Chinese trade, American exporters risk losing a loyal customer. Canada remains the United States' largest export market. If even a fraction of that commerce shifts toward Asia, U.S. manufacturers could lose billions in annual revenue. The irony is sharp. Trump promised to bring jobs home and weaken Beijing's reach. But his approach has pushed Canada, America's closest ally, to cooperate with China instead. The more Washington tightens, the more Ottawa looks for air.
For decades, Washington stood at the center of North America's economy. Every major supply chain, from autos to agriculture, ran through the United States. But that order is now shifting. Canada is quietly building a more independent path, one that connects west to east rather than north to south. The upcoming Carney-Xi meeting, if confirmed, will symbolize that evolution. For China, the summit would mark a small diplomatic victory. For Canada, it would prove that middle powers can still navigate between giants. In this new landscape, Trump's tariffs look less like strength and more like self-inflicted isolation. His America First policy has left allies searching for alternatives. Canada's outreach to China is not a betrayal. It is a reflection of a global economy that refuses to stand still. The message is clear. When trade becomes a weapon, nations find new allies. Canada's decision to reopen with China may reshape the balance of power in North America, forcing Washington to confront the limits of its own strategy. Trump's tariffs were meant to rebuild American control. Instead, they have rebuilt Canada's independence. And as the world watches Ottawa's next move, one thing is certain:
The ripple effects of this policy reversal will extend far beyond Beijing, far beyond Washington, and deep into the future of the North American economy.
We have what the world wants. Take on the energy side, we are an energy superpower.
We are here to unlock an opportunity to export LNG to Europe. We're here to deliver a critical mineral for our defense interests.
In New York, Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke about Canada's place in a world where the old order is crumbling. At the very same time, Premier Susan Holt of New Brunswick was making the case for her province's projects in Ottawa. 2 stages, 1 national story. Both leaders pointed to the same truth. Donald Trump's tariff policies, meant to corner Canada, are instead accelerating an energy and infrastructure push that could reshape the map. What was designed as pressure is turning into momentum. Canada is moving faster to link its resources to Europe, and in doing so, it is creating competition for the United States. New Brunswick has felt the sharp edge of America's tariffs. Steel, aluminum, and softwood duties have hit local businesses. The provincial government confirmed in its fiscal projections that the deficit increased by 120 million Canadian dollars beyond what was forecast in March 2025. Ottawa has responded by building buffers and laying foundations. Carney has cut federal taxes on income and capital, removed barriers to trade between provinces, and passed a law to fast-track hundreds of billions of dollars in new projects across energy, artificial intelligence, minerals, and trade corridors. Holt is focused on one concrete project. The St. John LNG terminal already exists, with tanks and berths ready to load ships bound for Europe. What is missing is a stretch of about 600 kilometers of pipeline to connect it to Western Canadian gas supplies. She argues that this is not a distant dream.
We don't have time to build a ton of new infrastructure. We have an existing LNG terminal in St. John that is ready to be used in the next few years.
Unlike new mega projects that take decades, this is a short addition to existing infrastructure. The business case has changed. European buyers are signaling interest not only because of the need to cut dependence on Russia, but also because trust in American supplies has been shaken.
They're a lot more wary about Russian sources, and right now they're even wary about American sources of fuel because of the way that relationship's been going.
The comparison with the U.S. Gulf Coast is stark. Gulf terminals are massive and efficient, but their lead times are long. Contracts are tied up years in advance, and voyages to Northwest Europe take longer. By contrast, St. John is only an Atlantic hop away. Europe's own leaders have said they are willing to pay more for stable, democratic sources of supply. Canada fits that bill. There are obstacles. Pipelines must pass through multiple provinces, and that requires environmental reviews, consultations, and financing. Political resistance is possible, and global competition remains fierce. Qatar and U.S. exporters are not stepping aside. Yet the fundamentals are shifting. Canada has already signed a comprehensive economic and security partnership with the European Union in June 2025, reinforcing that energy will be part of a broader strategic relationship. The infrastructure on the East Coast, if completed, would put Canadian gas into that framework. Carney put it plainly.
This is not a transition, this is a rupture. This is a sharp change in a short period of time, driven by a variety of factors.
For the United States, the lesson is uncomfortable. Tariffs were supposed to discipline Canada and bring concessions. Instead, they pushed Canada toward Europe, encouraged provinces like New Brunswick to double down on projects, and gave Ottawa a political mandate to fast-track development. As the U.S., Mexico, and Canada move toward the 2026 review of their trade pact, the White House could face a neighbor armed with new leverage. For Canada, the opportunity is clear. If it can build the pipeline, manage its deficit responsibly, and deliver gas to Europe, it will gain lasting bargaining power and revenues. For Europe, the payoff is diversification in a moment when energy security is fragile. The entire chain of events underscores how pressure can create unintended consequences. Trump's tariffs were meant to contain Canada. Instead, they have sped up its emergence as a competitor, one pipeline away from turning Atlantic Canada into a gateway of energy for Europe.
Tariffs on canola came up unexpectedly. If they can come on fast, then come off fast. And the Chinese are just going to want something in return.
This is something that the Prime Minister has been looking at. That being said, when it comes to EVs, you saw what we announced. First and foremost, we said that we would be lifting the ZAV mandate.
Just a few days ago, President Donald Trump renewed his call for allies to stand with the United States and punish China with higher tariffs. In his vision, Canada should act like a loyal soldier, following Washington's lead no matter the cost. Ottawa did not answer directly. Instead, it sent a very different signal. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government is now considering rolling back the 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, a tariff that was originally designed to keep pace with Washington. This move looks like a bucket of cold water thrown straight into Trump's face. While he praises America first and expects others to fall in line, Canada is showing that it is ready to step out of America's shadow to defend its own economy. The shift is not accidental. It comes after China retaliated with tariffs that crushed Canada's canola industry, a backbone of prairie agriculture. Farmers in Saskatchewan, the heartland of canola, are being squeezed. On one side, Ottawa's tariff wall on Chinese EVs. On the other, Beijing's 76% duty on canola imports imposed in mid-August. For farmers, this is not abstract geopolitics. It is a simple question of survival. Can they sell their harvest without losing money? When Premier Scott Moe returned from his mission to China with a message of more constructive talks than expected, it confirmed the pressure on Ottawa to shift course.
The EV tariff was first introduced to shield Canada's auto sector and align with Washington's strategy against Beijing. But the cost has been severe. Beijing struck back by targeting canola, one of Canada's most valuable farm exports. With duties near 76%, farmers now face the prospect of selling their harvest below production cost. Scott Moe's trip to Beijing provided a rare opening. He met directly with the officials who imposed the tariffs and described the discussions as unexpectedly positive. When he returned, Carney publicly thanked him, a gesture that showed Ottawa now sees the crisis for prairie farmers as urgent as protecting auto workers. Canada is stuck in a trade-off that pits crops against cars, and the balance can no longer hold.
In Ottawa, the tone is clearly shifting. Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly has acknowledged the government is reviewing the EV tariff and exploring new imports from Japan, South Korea, and Europe. That is a clear departure from the firm stance of earlier months. On the Chinese side, the revival of the Joint Economic Trade Commission after 7 years shows Beijing is willing to re-engage. Premier Moe reported the Chinese officials expressed a readiness to look forward rather than back. These developments suggest the two sides are testing ways to recalibrate their trade relationship, not only on canola, but in a broader framework. If Canada removes the EV tariff, the immediate effect would be relief for farmers. China could ease its duties, restoring access to a premium market that Canadian producers rely on. Consumers would benefit from cheaper electric vehicles, though domestic manufacturers would face new competition. Ottawa could also seize the chance to demand that Chinese automakers build plants in Canada, creating jobs and strengthening supply chains. The political dimension is equally important. On the surface, this looks like a direct snub to Trump, who has urged Ottawa to join his tariff wall against Beijing. But in practice, it is more about pragmatism than open defiance. Canada cannot afford to sacrifice its farm economy simply to stay in Washington's good books, especially when Trump's own tariffs continue to hit Canadian metals, lumber, and energy exports. By recalibrating, Canada is signaling that it will defend its own workers and industries first. It is not abandoning the United States, but it is refusing to blindly follow. In today's fractured global economy, such independence may be the only way for Canada to navigate between two superpowers without losing its footing at home.